Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It is an honor to have you on. Like I just mentioned off air, I'm a lifelong Husker fan, grew up in Nebraska. And as I'm sure you are well aware, pretty much every little boy grows up wanting to play at Nebraska. So you are a household name where I come from, but a lot of the guys out there may not know who you are. So before we dive in, tell us a little bit about Tom Osborne, the husband, the dad, and maybe even the granddad.
Well, I'm been married to Nancy, and we got married in '62, so that means 58 years, something like that. We've been married. We have 3 children, and our oldest son is Mike, and Mike is now 54, 55, and then we have a daughter, Ann Wilkie, and she's in her early 50s, and then my youngest daughter is Suzanne, and she just turned 51. So have those 3 children, and we have 5 grandkids. Mike has 2 children, and those children are Katie, and she works at St. Mark's United Methodist, and then our grandson Will is works pretty much in the tech industry. He's in his late 20s now. Then we have Haley Wilkie, who's an artist and does some work again in the tech industry in Omaha. She's married. And then we have a grandson, Christian Wilkie. Christian is in his junior year over at Concordia. He plays basketball there. And then we have a young son, a grandson, who's been adopted, and his name is Hudson Hintz. And so we have 5 grandkids, and most of them are local, so that's good.
Yeah.
Way to school, but they've all gravitated back this way, so we're very fortunate there.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying there. I actually have a grandson he just turned 1 last spring. I guess he's coming up on 2 here before we know it. And they recently moved to Colorado. So I understand, what a blessing it is to have them local. That really is a blessing. Well, let's touch on your football career, because again, those guys listening may not know who you are. I think one could argue that you're one of, if not the most prolific college football coach that has ever been involved in the game. But I know your career stretched beyond just coaching. So give us a quick snapshot of your football career.
All right. Well, if you want me to go back into the ancient past, probably one of the most significant dates that I can remember is December 7th, 1941. That was the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And I remember my dad's reaction, because it came over the radio, and he jumped out of his chair and he said, "I'm going to get into this thing." I was only 4 years old, and at that point I didn't quite know what had happened, but I knew it was something pretty big. So he joined up, and he left when I was 4, and was in European theater, landed on Utah Beach, went across France, Belgium, Germany, and came back at the end of the war in 1945. And of course, by then I was 9, and he was a stranger to me. And but he loved athletics, and so I wanted to be a good athlete. I wanted to please him, and so part of my interest in athletics was simply because of my dad's connection and wanting to be pleasing to him. But I also liked athletics.
Sure.
I also had some talent, and so we lived across the street from Hastings College, and I was over at their football practices every day, watching them and getting some of their old equipment, helmets, shoulder pads. And then when it was basketball season, I was over in the gym watching them. And at the end of practice, they'd leave about 20 minutes where the lights were still on. We could go out on the basketball court and shoot baskets. And I was over there for track practice and watched them do that. So I grew up playing them all. And in high school, football, basketball, track, and in the summer played baseball. And so had some success, was offered scholarships at the University of Nebraska to play football and basketball. And
Wow.
the football coach said, I came to Nebraska and could only play football, I couldn't play basketball because there was some overlap.
Sure.
And the basketball coach said the same thing. He said, you can only play basketball, you can't play football. But I really wanted to play both sports, probably wanted to run track too. And at that time, the university wasn't really doing all that well. And I knew the coaches and was very familiar with Hastings College because that's where I had grown up. And so I went to Hastings, had some other offers from places like Wyoming and some other schools. But so anyway, went to Hastings College and played football, basketball, ran track. And was kind of fortunate because we played in a bowl game at that time, which was not very significant. It was called the Mineral Water Bowl in Excelsior Springs, Missouri. We played William Jewell. And the referee that day was a guy named John Waldorf. And John Waldorf later became the head of officials in the Big 8 Conference.
Ah.
And he had a brother named Len Waldorf. He was called Pappy Waldorf. And he was the head of player personnel for the San Francisco 49ers. And apparently I had played well enough to catch John's attention that day as he refereed and recommended me to his brother. And so I got drafted by the 49ers. But that was a very long shot because at that time there were 30 draft choices. Today, each team only has 7 draft picks. So I went out there, and at that time there were only 20 or 38 players on a roster. Today there's 53, and all 38 49ers were back. Nobody was traded or cut. So the chances of me as a 19th round draft pick making that team were very, very slim. So we went to camp. There were 30 free agents, there were 30 draft picks, and there were 38 49ers who were returning. And I made it through one cut, another cut, another cut. Finally got down toward the end, and so they kept me on what was called the taxi squad. They kept 5 more guys that helped fill out the practice roster. And I roomed with a guy named Jack Kemp at that time, who later became the vice presidential nominee and was fairly well known. And I remember one time we had a meeting with a guy named Fido Murphy. He was kind of a Damon Runyon type character, and they're starting up this new league, the American Football League. And Fido wanted Jack and me to come down and play in San Diego. And Jack said, yes, he'd like to do that. And I said, no, I stay with 49ers. So the next year I went back to 49ers, went to the Army, did 6 months in between. And then went down to final cut again. I played in most of the exhibition games, played pretty well. And the 49ers decided they're going to draft Ray Norton, who's an Olympic sprinter. And I got cut again. I was picked up by the Redskins. And so I spent 2 years with the Redskins. We didn't have very good teams, but I played for them, started for them. And then one of the difficult things was that they had us run a mile at training camp my last year. And I put a lot into it, ran pretty hard, tightened up a little bit. And then they said, now we're going to run 40-yard dashes, which was really dumb because you don't want to run 40s after you've already run a mile for time. And I pulled a hamstring. And but I was kind of on the bubble. I mean, I felt like I had to keep practicing. So I kept shooting it with Novocaine. I'd play in a game. I couldn't walk the next day. And pretty soon a lot of scar tissue built up. And I felt I probably wouldn't be able to go back again because every time I started to run it knotted up. So I came back to Nebraska, and a guy named Bob Devaney had just been hired from Wyoming. And so the first week Bob was on campus in January of 1962, I went over to see him. I planned to be in college administration. I was going to work on a doctor's degree. And I thought maybe I'd ease my way out of athletics by being a graduate assistant coach. And Bob said, well, he said, I really don't need any more coaches. He said, I've got all I need. I said, I do have some guys over in the dorm. And these guys are acting up, and they've caused trouble, and they've thrown the dorm counselor out. And they're sort of running the show over there. He said, I need somebody to move in there and ride herd on them. So I said, well, okay. He said, and if you'll do that, I'll give you free meals on the training table. So I moved in with the guys, broke up a few fights, and was a character witness in a couple of cases where they were going to throw him out of school. And then as spring ball approached, he must have liked what I did. So I said, well, I think maybe we could use you as a graduate assistant coach. And so that's what I did. I got married at that time to Nancy Medvedere. And so things were going along pretty well. And finally I got my PhD in 3 years.
Wow.
And so that at that point it was time to decide what I was going to do. And finally went into Bob and I said, Bob, I can make $10,000 as a full professor. And if you can pay me $10,000 as an assistant coach, I think I just am having a hard time cutting loose football. So he said, okay. He said, I can do that. And so I became a full-time assistant coach and eventually offensive coordinator. We had some good years, won some national championships in 70, 71. And then he decided he was going to step aside and be just the AD. And he said he'd like me to be the head coach, which surprised me because the coaches that had come with him from Wyoming were older, more experienced. And so I took over in 1973 as head coach and coached for 25 years. And we, for the most part, were successful. We didn't have what you'd call a bad year. I mean, the worst year we had was 9-3. And we won some national championships and quite a few conference championships. And so that was kind of my coaching career. But football was my life. And so I was involved in football as a player for quite a long time. In 36 years, 11 as an assistant, 25 as a head coach. So I guess if you ask me what my occupation was, I'd have to say, well, it was football coach. And of course, I had an assistant named Frank Solich, and I told Frank that I'd go 5 years, and then I would try to see if he wouldn't be the head coach. And 5 years came. I extended it 1 year because we had a couple of players who would have been first-round draft picks who decided they'd come back. And I said to Frank, I said, I don't think it's fair to me to quit if these guys are going to come back and pass up $15 million a year apiece. And so we extended it 1 year, and then Frank became the head coach.
So that promise is what led to your retirement ultimately.
Right, yeah. So I got out of coaching. I taught at the university for a year, and then decided I'd like to try to do something challenging. And so the 3rd District congressional seat opened up. And I was from the 3rd District. In the 3rd District, if people in Nebraska don't know what that is, that's everything from York on west. So
okay.
64,000 square miles. It's probably more than 80% of the land mass of Nebraska. And it's mostly rural. Biggest town would be Grand Island in the 3rd District. And so I was successful in attaining that seat. Spent 6 years in Washington in Congress, in the House. and was on the education committee, was on transportation, agriculture, and was able to get a fair amount done because the Republicans, which I was at that time, were in the majority. And George Bush was the president. And then I decided that I'd run for governor because I felt I could make more influence, have more influence as a governor. And I ran against Dave Heineman, who was an incumbent. And and Dave beat me in the primary. And so that left me out of politics, which was okay, you know. And then for some reason I was asked to become the AD. I was AD for 5 years. But then I was 75 years old at that time. I thought, you know, I don't want people to sit around and say, well, the guy's past his prime, he's too old. And so I resigned at that point. And so we started Teammates back in 1991. And that's what I continue to be most active in is Teammates mentoring program that now mentors about 11,000 kids. And we're in 5 states, primarily in Nebraska. We're also in Iowa, we're in Kansas, we're in Wyoming and South Dakota. And have grown pretty rapidly.
This podcast is part of the Edify Podcast Network. Edify is a faith-inspiring app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. Cut through the noise and grow your faith by diving into the world's top Christian podcasts today. Download the Edify app for free from the App Store or Google Play, or by going to edify.app. That's edifi.app.
So let's unpack Teammates. So the Teammates mentoring organization. So you founded it while you were a coach. Was there something during that period of time, something specific or someone specific that inspired you to found this organization?
Well, yes, definitely. You know, I started coaching back in 1962. And so I had a point of reference back in the early 60s. And I noticed as time went by and I became head coach, and as time went on, I was dealing with more and more personal issues and more personal baggage and
With the players.
Yeah. Probably had less time with X's and O's, although we still were working 85, 90-hour weeks. So, I mean, you put in a lot of hours, but what had changed significantly over that period of time was family structure, because most of those kids that you recruited back in the 60s were all growing up in a family under one roof, both biological parents. And as time went on, that began to change significantly. I began to see more and more kids who were from single parent families.
Yep.
Some even from no parent families. And I saw what that did to them. They were not bad kids, but there was less stability in their life.
Yeah.
And there were more tugs and pulls and pushes in different directions. And of course, we saw the advent of the drug culture in the late 60s. You had Woodstock, and you had sort of a time of revolt and a very unsteady period from 68 through 72, 73. And eventually we began to drug test our players, which back in the 60s would have been unheard of. But mostly that was triggered by performance enhancing drugs, but also recreational drugs. And there was a time when I would never have thought that would have been something that a coaching staff would have to do. And so we started doing that in about 1985, which is the first time that we really had the technology to test. And invariably we'd have 2 or 3 kids that would show up as freshmen positive, even though we'd sent out a letter at the start of the summer telling them they would be drug tested when they came in August. And usually we had a policy where first time you were positive, yeah, we would notify parents, and then we subject them to weekly drug tests. And usually within about 6 months, they'd had a second positive, which meant automatic suspension for a period of time. And then if you had a third positive, then you're gone. And most of those kids that came in and tested positive right away wouldn't last. They'd probably be around about 6 months. Because if you went into their case history, you'd find that they had probably started in the 7th or 8th grade, quite often with marijuana. And then when crunch time came, a big test coming up or something to do in athletics, they would revert back and wouldn't be able to get off of it. And usually those kids had less stability in their families.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we began to see the changes in what kids were exposed to, the movies, some of the content, the lyrics of music. And then with the advent of the internet, social media, and so messages that would have been impossible to see back in the early 60s became more commonplace and much more destructive, and lots of pornography, those kinds of things. And so that was a concern as well. And then, of course, as I mentioned, social media began in the 90s, and we always told our players to stay off of it. But they'd have a bad game, and they'd see how they had 100 people sending them nasty messages, and that became more difficult to handle too. So what I came to believe by the early 90s was that kids were really traversing a much more difficult landscape than probably ever before in our history. So many more forces pulling them and pushing them in different directions, and at the same time, less stability, less grounding because of sometimes a family structure that was broken. And so I got up in front of our players one day and I said, how many of you guys be willing to serve as a mentor to some 7th or 8th grade boys in the Lincoln Public School? Why I picked 7th and 8th grade, I don't know, but just popped into my head.
Sure.
And I thought, number one, maybe it could do some kids some good. And number two, I thought it would probably do our players some good.
Sure.
To give of themselves and to invest in some kid. And so 22 hands went up. So we went to the Lincoln Public Schools and we said, do you have 22 kids that you can find that you think would like a mentor, could benefit from a mentor? And so they said, yeah. And at that time, we knew nothing, very little about what we were doing. We just said, see them once a week. You can bring them to practice if you want, take them to a movie, whatever. Just see them once a week. Then once a month, we'd get them all together, all the mentors and mentees. We'd play some basketball, we'd have some pizza. We'd usually bring in a speaker. Somebody would talk a little bit about academic performance, setting goals, etc. And that was it. And then as time went on, those relationships seemed to remain strong. And those kids got to be seniors in high school. And we were very pleased because of the 22, 21 graduated on time. And the ones that we were given by the schools were not necessarily straight A students. They were not necessarily going to be Phi Beta Kappa. And most of them had some issues. So I thought, well, that's pretty good. And the one that didn't graduate actually was riding dirt bikes on a motocross tour. And he did graduate, but he was delayed a semester or a year. And then we got some money together and we said, if you guys will stay out of trouble and graduate, we'll pay your way to college.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So we raised about $250,000. And that was the money at that time. And we were pleased that of the 22, 18 went on to college. And some of them did really well. And so I thought, well, maybe there's something to this, just maybe showing some attention and offering some guidance. And so we began to expand the program, first here in Lincoln and then across the state. And of course, we learned a lot about mentoring. It became a school-based program. So we didn't have mentoring outside of school. And we wanted the mentor to meet once a week with the mentee. We trained the mentor and didn't just throw them to the wolves. We made sure they knew the guidelines and a little bit about how to open conversations and things that they should stay away from. And we also trained the mentee to understand that this wasn't going to be a gift-giving deal. This is not going to be somebody who was going to be somebody you could count on for money or those kinds of things. Because we felt that would get in the way of the relationship. And so we've expanded, as I said, to about 1,100 kids in those 5 states. And we'd like to hit 12,000 this next year if we could. COVID has really interrupted things because if you're school-based, you can imagine the disruption. And so we have developed a portal where we do some online mentoring, mostly with kids in the school. And some mentors are uncomfortable going into school. Some schools are shut down, don't want mentors coming in. So it's been a little bit more challenging right now. We're hoping that things will normalize somewhat later this spring and we'll get back into a normal routine.
Yeah, no, we're all praying for that. And 12,000, I mean, that's a great lofty goal. Think about the impact, the global impact that could have when you think about the compounding effects of that.
Right. Yeah.
Tom, I'm curious, you laid out a lot of history there, and I think it's interesting how you pointed out how society has evolved over the decades, how that trickled down into your teams throughout the years, and how you saw a change in the players because of their lack of direction at home. And I think that just underscores the importance that men, fathers at home, the roles that we have, we're called to lead our families, to guide them, to lay out a path for them to succeed in life. And like you said, when kids don't have that, it's very easy for them to get pulled into directions that can take them down the wrong path in life. And I know that you've probably had players that you've crossed paths with over the years that, like you said, lack that direction and maybe weren't able to find a mentor in time to allow them to avoid, ultimately negative outcomes. But I'm curious, going back to your personal history, have you personally been impacted by a mentor at all during your life?
Yeah, well, I mentioned my dad being overseas for 5 years, and he was older. He was 36 at that time when I was 4 years old, because during the Depression, people really couldn't afford to get married because they just didn't have the money to do that. And at that time, it was assumed that if you got married, that the wife didn't work and the husband was a provider. And particularly when children came along, that the wife stayed home full time.
Yep.
And that was just the way things were. So when he left, he was 36. And most of the kids in school with me, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, were kids that had dads at home because my dad didn't have to go. He was beyond draft age. He had a family. And most of those kids' dads didn't have to go. And they didn't go. And so I felt somewhat unworthy. I think I could relate to what a lot of kids are going through today who are without dads, because you feel somehow a little less complete. You feel that there's something missing. And I was fortunate that I had an uncle who lived across the road from us, and he was a banker, but he loved to hunt and fish. And so he would take me along. He ran trap lines, he fished, he hunted. And I developed a love of hunting and fishing because of him. He taught me how to swim. And having him in my life was really important. My mom, everybody was patriotic, and my mom worked in an ammunition plant, and my dad was gone overseas. And one day the ammunition plant in Grand Island blew up, and a lot of people were killed. Fortunately, my mom wasn't one of them, and my dad wrote home and insisted that she quit because he said one of them needed to live through the war. And so she came back and started teaching school again. And we moved in with our grandparents. And my grandmother really became a part-time mother to me. And my uncle helped out. So I saw the power of having a mentor at that time. And I guess that was part of the reason that I thought that maybe starting something like Teammates, although at that time it was just 22 players mentoring 22 kids.
Right.
No name to we weren't planning on any large scale operation.
Well, there's something to be said about just keeping it simple, like you said. And I think for guys out there listening who've maybe thought about mentoring, but are gun shy for whatever reason, maybe it's because they feel like they don't have time, or they don't feel like they're adequately trained, or that they're not qualified. I think that, I guess, what would you have to say to those guys out there, specifically when it comes to the Teammates organization? What would you say to those guys to kind of help them get over that mental hurdle of, well, it's not for me, not right now anyway?
Right. Well, the thing about it is that you sometimes hear the time issue. I'm so busy. But most of our mentoring occurs over the lunch period. And those lunch periods are usually in the public schools about 35, 40 minutes long. And everybody eats lunch somewhere.
Sure.
So all you have to do is go eat lunch with a kid. And we have a building coordinator in each school building that we're in. And that coordinator will find a place for you to meet, maybe the library, maybe the lunchroom, whatever. And they'll sign you in, sign you out. If you have any issues, any questions, like you find that your person that you're mentoring is really struggling with math, maybe, well, you go talk to the coordinator and say, this is becoming a problem, and they'll get a tutor in math or whatever. That's one of the benefits from school-based mentoring, is you have a support system there. You've got a school nurse. If there's some health issue, you've got a school counselor if there's a psychological issue. And it isn't that you pass everything off to somebody else, but if you can care about another person and invest 30, 40 minutes a week, which everybody can, it's not that hard. And we find that school-based mentoring is very helpful because if you mentor at night or on the weekends, sometimes you're taking time away from your own children. And if you simply go have lunch with a young person, or maybe you have 10 o'clock, that's a period in the morning, and your young person has a homeroom or has a period in a library or shop or something. We don't normally take kids out of math or the solid subjects, but we will take them out of other classes, the school will. And so we feel that it's very adjustable. And if on a given day when you normally mentor, you can't be there that day, you just call the coordinator and say, well, I can't come today, but I could come Thursday. And they arranged it. And so it's very easy to do. And we do provide training. It's important to understand that. And we have all kinds of portals where if it's dealing with race issues, or it's dealing with drugs, or whether it's a broken family, there's all kinds of instructional videos that we have, and all kinds of openers as to some kind of board games or things where you can break the ice. So
yeah,
this is a case where somebody's got to invent it on their own.
Yeah, I think that's a good reminder for the guys listening that there's training available. And I think just like in parenting, you don't always have to have the answers, right? Sometimes the kids just want somebody to talk to or just share time with. And then that can lead to deeper, more meaningful conversations down the road once a relationship has been formed. But yeah, you don't have to go into this feeling like you have all the answers right away. That's for sure. And I think the impact that a mentor can have on a mentee is pretty obvious. And unless you have some stories around that, my other question, the flip side of that would be, can you think of any unique stories where that demonstrate the impact that a mentee can have on their mentor?
Well, I think that I kept hearing over and over again from mentors. They'd say, you know, I think I get as much or more out of this than a mentee. And I puzzled about that. And so I sent out an email to about 50 people who had been longtime faithful mentors. And I said, and I hear this a lot. What does that mean to you? Why do people say that? And of course, I got back a variety of responses. Some said, well, it has made me a much better parent because I see how powerful it is in the life of a child just to have somebody who sits and listens and who listens empathetically and who does not try to interfere or micromanage or fix the kid, but just simply listens and is there and is somebody who cares about them. And he said, I see the impact that's meant to my mentee. And I realized that I really wasn't doing that with my own kids.
Mm. That's powerful.
Yeah. I wasn't really taking time to listen to them. I was telling them I was sometimes there for their events, but I wasn't really listening. And they said one of the reasons it's made me a better parent is it's given me a window into the life of young people where they're willing to tell me things that probably my own children would not necessarily share. And so I began to see the world they're living in and see it from their perspective. So that's one thing. Another thing they say quite often is that it kind of makes my day when that young person runs to greet me. And I can see they're excited that I'm there and they're pleased that I'm there and they care about my being there. And so I always go back to work energized and feeling better about things. And so there are a lot of different responses they give, but underneath it all, as I began to get those responses and listen to them and think about them, I think that really what doing something for somebody who on the surface can't do anything for you in return, if you do something for them consistently over a period of time, it adds a dimension of meaning and purpose in your life. Because there was a study done a few years ago by Johns Hopkins, and they asked several thousand people, are you happy? And most Americans said, well, yeah, I'm relatively happy. And they found that happiness was primarily defined by having enough food to eat, having shelter, having a job, having a car, having some time to spend on recreation. But it was mostly temporal type of happiness, comes and it goes. And then they said, do you feel your life has meaning and purpose? And the general answer that came back at that point was, well, not so much. An awful lot of Americans do not feel they have very much significance or meaning or purpose to their existence. And they found that meaning and purpose usually comes from giving and serving and sometimes sacrificing. And so if you do something for somebody that can't do anything for you, you're usually going to be nice to your boss. You're usually going to be fairly nice to your wife because of some reciprocity. And but if you serve somebody who, on the surface of it, can't do anything for you in return, you do get an element of meaning and purpose to your life by giving and serving. And of course, obviously, from what I've said previously, you do get something back. You get the sense that this means something to that person. And so there are small milestones where, and I'll give you an example. There was a mentor who started mentoring this young kid when he was in the 3rd grade. And so this kid's dad was in prison, and his mom had 4 kids, and she was kind of falling apart emotionally and really struggling and having trouble making ends meet financially, but also just being able to deal with it. And so she was struggling. And so the mentor was faithful and mentored this kid through the 3rd grade, but he was missing a lot of school. He was missing 20, 30 days a year.
Wow.
And because if he just decided he had the sniffles or just didn't want to go to school that day, the mom just didn't have the strength or the energy or the capacity to see to it that it happened. And so the mentor kept talking to him about it, and eventually the young guy began to go to school a little bit more and started at least not flunking everything and passing a class here and there. And by middle school, he was doing reasonably well. And by high school, he did okay and he graduated. And that was a major milestone because at one point it didn't look like he was going to do that. And he began to get his feet on the ground. And then he went to Southeast Community College and he qualified for a Pell Grant. He qualified for a grant from NELNET. Anybody living below the poverty line, they'll pay your tuition to Southeast Community College if you graduate from Lincoln Public Schools. And so I went to school there, and he was interested in welding. And last I knew, he'd gone to Florida to be an underwater welder, which pays really well. And so the point is that this kid might have made it on his own, but the odds are pretty good coming from that situation. It would not have worked out well. And so if you feel that you can make a difference in the life of a young person and put that life in a better trajectory, you've probably accomplished something that's pretty significant when you think about the long-term ripple effect. Because we find, and I'll give you another example, there was a mentor we had in Omaha, similar deal where the kid wasn't going to school. And he kept pointing out that the kids on the honor roll were in school every day. And finally, this young guy began to get the picture, started going to school every day because of that mentor, and eventually ended up on the honor roll. And he got a scholarship to Creighton and went to school there. And he had 2 younger brothers, and they were kind of like he was. They weren't going to school much. And they began to see what happened to their brother, and they started going to school. And he graduated, and one of them got a scholarship to UNL. And then the mom, who did not have a high school diploma, I don't believe, saw what happened to her kids. And she went back and got her degree and went on to college. And so there usually is a ripple effect. This mentor only mentored that one kid from that family, but it impacted the whole family. And so you'll find that is not just, it goes unilaterally, but it's also a longitudinal effect, because the children that young guy, that mentor had, will probably do better with their life because of that mentor, and maybe the grandchildren, and on and on.
Wow, 100%. And that's inspiring. And I just think about, the inspired legacy. My mission with this platform is to equip and inspire men to be better leaders at home so that we can change the world one dad at a time. And when you think about that idea, coupled with this idea of mentoring and the potential ripple effects that can occur there, and this is a viable way to make a huge impact, not just in your world, but the entire world. So the work that you guys are doing is phenomenal. Tom, I'm curious. I know you're a man of faith and it's manifested its way on the field and off the field, but how has faith helped you specifically be a better husband, dad, coach, and mentor?
Well, I think that there's such a thing as true north. I used to be a pilot, wasn't a very good one, but I survived a few years of flying. And one thing you learn is that the compass doesn't point toward true north. There's magnetic north, and but if you follow magnetic north far enough north, you miss the true North Pole by about 2,000 miles.
Oh,
So
wow.
there has to be an adjustment on your compass to be able to fly and make sure you're in and up in the right place. And I would guess that that's what my faith has done for me, is to try to make sure that there are certain core principles and values that will keep me headed on the right path and toward true north. And that has to be not a sometime thing. It's got to be kind of an all the time thing. And so I was thinking about the Nick Saban talks a little bit about mission, talks about purpose, and he talks about process. And I met a guy named John Wooden many years ago. John was a basketball coach out at UCLA, and then in a 12-year period, John won 10 NCAA championships. Unheard of. Won 88 basketball games in a row, home and away. That's amazing. And
Yeah.
I heard that John never mentioned the word winning to his players. And I visited with him a couple of times. Actually, visited with him the last time when he was 99, about 4 months before he died. But he wrote some books, and I followed what he wrote. And he said I never mentioned winning because the process was the most important thing. And the first thing he did, the first practice with his players, he showed them how to put their socks on so they wouldn't get blisters, and how to get in a defensive stance, and how to pass the ball, how to bend your knees on a free throw, and all the fundamentals. And what he said was, if you practice the right things with enough intensity on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, you didn't need to talk about winning, because the process would take care of the winning and losing. And so I adopted that. I never mentioned winning to our players. And we talked about the things that were critical to playing at the highest level. And like turnovers, taking care of the ball, blocking downfield, all the locking your arms, keeping your head up, driving your feet on a tackle. And our practices were hard, and our practices were disciplined. And so what we did on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday was the whole deal. I was never a great motivational speaker. Sometimes people think that you win a game because of your pregame speech. But if you're up there 20 minutes before kickoff, a million things are going through those guys' minds. They're not hearing you. They're just wanting to get out on that field. They're worried about the kickoff, and so it's got to be done before the kickoff.
Sure.
And so the process is a critical thing, and that's true also in your spiritual life. I mean, there's the process, and so I try to spend some time every day in the scriptures. I spend some time every day in prayer. And it can't just be, now I lay me down to sleep, or please let me make this sale, or give this to me, or do this for me. The purpose of prayer, as I see it, is to get aligned with what God would have you do, rather than to try to get God aligned to what you want. That ain't gonna work very good. You're still gonna miss some sales. You're gonna lose some games. There's gonna be illness. There's gonna be problems. But if you can get yourself pretty much aligned, and you do some listening to what he wants you to do, you have a lot better chance to get yourself toward what would be defined as true north. And it's got to be just like football practice, it has to be a regular thing. Can't be hit or miss, can't be just Sunday morning, or just when you feel like it. And so my feeling is there's been a discipline to it, and that's been important.
Man, I knew there was a reason I wanted to have you on the show. I could listen to you talk for hours. Tom, this has been amazing. My final question for you is about legacy. And there's no doubt that you have left a powerful, lasting legacy on the field and off the field. When you hear the phrase an inspired legacy, if Tom Osborne wants to leave an inspired legacy, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think I may disappoint you here. You know, I often see people worried about their legacy. And I think when you're worried about your legacy, it kind of gets in the way of your legacy. I mean, I remember seeing politicians wanting to get a certain piece of legislation passed because it would enhance their legacy.
Sure.
And pretty soon getting that legislation passed is more important than the basic things. You know, does that piece of legislation really serve the greater good? Is it really good for the country, or is it good for you? And so when legacy becomes all about you, then I think that that's not a big deal. But I think the important thing is, you know, Jesus said this. He said, whoever would be greatest among you must be the servant of all. And so I think the essential thing about legacy is simply that you served, and that you were as consistent as you could be in trying to follow what God would have you do. And you're not always going to be perfect. You're gonna make mistakes. You're not gonna hear that still small voice as well as you think you did. And but if your heart's in the right place and your purpose is generally to be of service and to try to be of use, then I think that's probably about all that we can ask from life. And,
sure.
And so, and that's one thing that I've tried to get across to people who are potential mentors. That's one way that you can serve. There are many other ways that you can serve, but that's one way that you can serve, and it certainly would honor God in most instances. So,
well, I'm not surprised, but that's one of the best answers I've had on the show. Tom, I want to thank you for everything that you've done for college football and everything that you've done for thousands of men out there off the field. And I want to thank you for your time. We're going to make sure that we link to all the ways that people can learn more about teammates and how they can maybe become a mentor and get involved. This has been amazing and a true honor for me to have you on. So thank you again.
You bet. Thank you for having me. Thanks for what you're doing.
Guys, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's conversation, share it with a friend and subscribe to the show so you don't miss future episodes like the one you heard today. And be sure to check today's show notes for all the ways you can stay plugged into the Inspired Legacy, including my free download called 9 Ways to Be a Better Dad. You can sign up for my free weekly devotional called Inspired Inbox. And you can join the private Facebook group, a community of other like-minded men looking to become the best husbands and fathers they can be. So get plugged in.
like, subscribe, leave a review, and help more guys find the show, because we need more men battling together for the sake of the next generation. Until next time, live inspired.